Imagine driving down a quiet highway, your mind at ease after a long journey, only to be stopped by a flashing red and blue light. What happens next isn't just a routine traffic stop. It's the beginning of a life-changing encounter. Meet Maya Foster, a seasoned lieutenant commander who finds herself facing an officer who's more interested in asserting power than following protocol. What starts as a simple stop spirals into a tense battle of rights and authority. But Maya isn't backing down. What she does next will challenge the very system that's meant to protect. Stay tuned to hear the shocking twists that will leave you questioning everything. The road was nearly empty that night. A few cars passed by with their headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the highway outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was late, just past 11 p.m., the kind of hour when most people just wanted to get home, to rest after a long day. But tonight was different for one woman. Lieutenant Commander Maya Foster had been driving for nearly 2 hours, her fingers lightly tapping against the steering wheel, humming along to the soft rhythm of an old jazz tune that played through the speakers. She wasn't in uniform, just a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a way that made her blend in, or so she thought. Then she saw it, the red and blue flashing lights in her rearview mirror, quickly gaining on her. Her stomach clenched, not from fear but from exhaustion. She had been on the road for what seemed like an eternity. Maya signaled, changed lanes, and eased her car onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, took a deep breath, and kept both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. She'd been in the military long enough to know what to do. The white patrol car stopped just behind her. The officer didn't rush, taking his time getting out. When he finally did, he moved like a man who expected to be obeyed. His boots scuffed against the asphalt as he approached, one hand resting on his belt, the other holding a flashlight that flicked on as he neared her car. Maya watched him through the side mirror, catching the name on his badge, Officer Clayton. License and registration. His voice was flat, practiced, and impatient.
No greeting, no explanation.
Maya met his eyes in the mirror, her face calm. Was I speeding, officer? She asked, her voice steady. Officer Clayton didn't answer right away. Instead, he took her papers, holding them just out of reach as he scanned the car. Tail lights are out, he said, his tone dismissive. She frowned, puzzled. That can't be right, she replied. Clayton finally looked at her, his gaze hard. Are you arguing with me? Maya could feel the change in the air, that tension where authority met resistance, the quiet expectation that one side would back down. She'd seen this before, in briefings, in training exercises designed to prepare her for situations just like this. But she wasn't about to back down. She knew her rights. I'm not arguing, she said calmly. I'm just saying my tail lights were checked recently. If there's an issue, I'll get it fixed. Clayton didn't care about her explanation. Step out of the car. Maya hesitated. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. He wasn't interested in fixing anything. He was looking for an excuse to escalate. Mind telling me why? She asked, her voice firm but calm. He smirked, his eyes narrowing. Because I said so. She didn't let the smirk get to her. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the cool night air. It wasn't cold, but it was enough to remind her that things were about to get a lot worse. She stepped onto the pavement with deliberate confidence, standing tall but not challenging. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wouldn't let herself be intimidated either. Turn around, Clayton ordered. Hands on the car. Maya hesitated for a second, then placed her hands on the roof of her car. Clayton took a step closer, his presence now a threat. Are you resisting? He asked, his voice suddenly hostile. No, Maya replied, her tone steady. I'm asking a question. A flicker of annoyance crossed Clayton's face. He didn't like being questioned, not by someone who wasn't afraid of him. But he was in control, or so he thought. Without warning, he reached for his radio. We got a non-compliant driver here, he muttered into the speaker. Then louder, turn around. Her pulse quickened, but her face stayed neutral. "Officer," she said, her voice low but firm, "I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do." That stopped him. For a moment he froze, staring at her, his jaw tightening. "You're under arrest," he snapped, reaching for her wrist. Maya moved before he could touch her, stepping back just enough to avoid his grip. "Under arrest for what?" she asked, her voice sharp. "For obstructing an officer," he growled, pulling out his cuffs. Maya exhaled sharply through her nose. She didn't have time to waste on his stupidity. He was trying to provoke her, to turn this into something bigger than it needed to be. Her military training kicked in, her heart steady, her breath even. She knew she had two choices: comply, fight later, or resist, and risk it escalating further. But Maya had seen this happen to others too many times. She wasn't about to become another statistic. She turned slowly, placing her hands on the roof of the car, the cold metal grounding her. Clayton didn't hesitate. He yanked her arms behind her, tightening the cuffs far too much. The pain was sharp, but she bit back the urge to react. He shoved her toward the patrol car, and she staggered but didn't fall. "You don't know what you're doing," she muttered under her breath. Clayton chuckled, pushing her into the back seat of the car with a rough shove. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." The hard plastic seat dug into her back as the door slammed shut, sealing her inside the patrol car. Clayton walked back to his vehicle, muttering into his radio. Maya sat still, wrists burning in the cuffs, her breath measured. She wasn't panicking. She had been through combat drills, interrogations, and high-stakes operations before. This was different. This was a man with a badge, drunk on power, convinced he was untouchable. Minutes passed, then 5, then 10. Maya shifted slightly, testing the cuffs. They were too tight. He had done that on purpose. The car jolted forward as Clayton slid in behind the wheel, whistling as he started the engine. The patrol car lurched forward, the overhead lights still flashing, casting red and blue reflections on the road. "You know," Clayton said, his voice smug, her tone dry. Clayton laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." Maya didn't respond. She wasn't playing his game. They drove in silence, the lights flashing in the mirrors behind them. It wasn't long before they arrived at the station, a squat gray brick building that stood alone in the quiet night. The parking lot was mostly empty, the late-night processing slow. Maya wasn't worried. She knew exactly what was coming. The cold metal bench was unforgiving as Maya sat, her wrists still aching from the tight cuffs. The holding cell was stark, just 4 walls and a flickering light that buzzed overhead. The faint smell of stale coffee and sweat lingered in the air, mixing with the sterile scent of disinfectant. It wasn't the worst place she'd been, but it was uncomfortable enough to remind her why she didn't want to spend another minute here. Still, she remained still, her posture straight, her mind calm. She'd been in situations far worse than this. Combat zones, high-stakes operations where the threat of danger was real and immediate. Not some petty power struggle between a man with a badge and a woman who refused to bend to his will. This was a different kind of fight. The kind that couldn't be won by physical strength or military tactics. This one required patience, control, and the understanding that sometimes winning meant enduring the unbearable. The first few minutes in the cell were quiet. The soft murmur of voices from the front desk, the occasional shuffle of paperwork, the clink of a coffee cup against the counter. These were the sounds that filled the air, punctuated by the far-off hum of fluorescent lights. Maya kept her breathing steady, controlling her thoughts. Her mind raced, but she was practiced in shutting out the noise, focusing only on what she could control. This was just a moment in time. It was a temporary setback, and she knew exactly how to turn it to her advantage. It didn't take long before she heard heavy footsteps approaching. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. His rhythm was unmistakable, the arrogant, deliberate stride of a man who thought he was in control. Officer Clayton. His footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway as he appeared in front of the bars, his expression hard, his posture brimming with that same false sense of superiority. He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. There was a smirk on his face, the kind that only came when someone thought they had one. But Maya wasn't intimidated. She didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of weakness. "Comfy?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Maya didn't answer, just kept her eyes fixed on his. There was something satisfying about watching him struggle to maintain that smug demeanor. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of reacting. Clayton didn't like that. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying her for a sign of resistance. "You know," he began, his voice low and condescending, "if you just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." Maya's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, her tone calm, almost serene. The words caught him off guard, and for a moment the smirk faltered. It was a small victory, but it was enough. Clayton stepped back, his jaw tightening, his eyes flashing with something dark. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he turned to walk away. Maya watched him go, a small part of her reveling in the shift in power. He thought he had control over her, but he was wrong. As he disappeared down the hallway, Maya's mind began to race. This was far from over. She had known from the beginning that Clayton's actions would lead to consequences. But the real question was when those consequences would catch up with him. Maya had made sure to leave a trail of evidence, subtle but unmistakable. The body cam footage from the stop, her calm demeanor despite his provocations. All of it was recorded. She had anticipated this. She knew the system better than he did, and this was only the beginning. Minutes passed, then half an hour. The noise from the front desk continued, but Maya barely noticed it. Her mind was elsewhere, running through the possibilities. She wasn't worried about her own fate. She knew this wouldn't last long. The real fight was going to be for justice, not just for her, but for everyone who had been wronged by officers like Clayton. People who didn't have the luxury of rank, connections, or a legal team to fight for them. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps again. Clayton was back, but this time his posture was different. His arrogance had been replaced with something else, frustration, maybe fear. He stood in front of the bars once more, but this time he didn't lean in. He didn't smirk. Instead, he stood there, glaring at her, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath, barely audible. Maya glanced at him, her gaze unwavering. "I don't have to think," she replied evenly. "I know." The words landed with a quiet impact, and she could see the flicker of irritation in his eyes. Clayton wasn't used to being talked to like that, not by anyone, especially not by someone he'd thought he could intimidate. He took a step closer, his hands balled into fists, but Maya didn't back down. She stood firm, unyielding, her expression calm but her resolve clear. Clayton opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a young officer approached from the hallway, clipboard in hand. He stopped a few feet away, his voice tentative. Sergeant?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously between the two. "We got a call." Clayton shot the officer a look, one that could have frozen water. But the younger officer didn't flinch. "I think you need to see this," he added, his voice quieter now. Clayton didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shot one last glance at Maya, his face hard, then turned and walked down the hallway, the younger officer following behind him. Maya leaned back against the wall, watching them go. She could hear their hushed conversation, the tension thick in the air. She couldn't make out all the words, but she knew enough. They were talking about her, talking about what had happened, and she was betting that they were starting to realize just how big of a mistake they'd made. Time seemed to stretch on as she waited. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, Clayton reappeared, his expression no longer smug but tight with something Maya couldn't quite place. He stopped in front of her cell again, his eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. "What the hell did you do?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Maya straightened, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I didn't do anything," she replied evenly. "But people talk. And some of us have friends in very high places." Clayton's face darkened. She could see the realization dawning on him, the quiet understanding that he was no longer in control of this situation. He turned on his heel and stormed off, disappearing down the hallway without a word. Maya exhaled slowly. It wouldn't be long now. She had made sure of that. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not for her. Not for anyone who had ever been subjected to this kind of abuse. When the truth came out, Clayton would regret everything. As the night wore on, the sounds of the station faded into the background. Maya sat in silence, her mind focused on the task ahead. The battle wasn't over yet, but it was close. And when it was over, things would change. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Clayton had no idea who he had messed with. The morning sun spilled through the narrow windows of the courthouse, casting long streaks of light across the polished floors. The air was crisp, and the chill seemed to settle deep in the bones of anyone who lingered too long in the silence. It was the kind of cold that made you feel the weight of time, each second dragging like the slow tick of a clock in a room full of tension. Inside, the court was filling up slowly, the buzz of whispered conversations fading as the judge made his entrance. Maya stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room. She was no longer in handcuffs, no orange jumpsuit, no holding cell. Instead, she was dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer, a simple blouse, and an undeniable presence that filled the space around her. Her attorney, Carla Whitman, was flipping through a stack of papers with a practiced efficiency. Carla barely looked up, her focus entirely on the case at hand. Maya appreciated that about her, no wasted movements, no small talk, just straight to the point. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and there he was, Officer Clayton. He walked in with that same arrogant stride, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, but there was something different in the way he moved now. The stiff, almost robotic movements of a man who had once felt untouchable, but now something had shifted. His steps were less sure, his gaze flickering nervously as he scanned the room. Maya caught his eye for a brief moment before he quickly looked away. She didn't need to say a word. He knew, and it was clear that he knew he wasn't in control anymore. The judge entered next, a man who appeared weary, his expression tired but authoritative. Judge Alan Kirkland adjusted his glasses and settled into his chair with a sigh, glancing over the case files before looking up at the room. "All right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's get to it." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat before speaking, his voice carrying throughout the courtroom. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Maya Foster, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Clayton Briggs." The room rippled with murmurs, and Clayton shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. The judge, peering over his glasses, regarded him with a sharp gaze. "Sergeant Briggs, care to explain?" Clayton leaned forward, his voice defensive. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop," he began, his words almost rehearsed. But before he could go any further, the prosecutor interrupted, holding up a document. "Uncooperative?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "Lieutenant Commander Foster's record shows a distinguished military career, graduate of the Naval Academy, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken tail light?" Clayton opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched, the weight of the question hanging in the air. The prosecutor didn't wait for a response. "Additionally," he continued, flipping through his papers, "an internal review of your arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Clayton's face turned red, his jaw clenching, but the prosecutor wasn't done. Are you seriously going to sit here and tell us that your actions weren't racially motivated? He raised an eyebrow, challenging Clayton. The judge leaned forward, his voice stern. Sergeant Briggs, I don't like what I'm hearing. The body cam footage says otherwise. Let's play the footage. The room fell silent as a screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. The video began to play, and Maya didn't need to turn to watch. She had lived through it. Clayton barking orders at her, her calm voice responding, his unnecessary escalation, the way he yanked her arms behind her back. The video played and the room absorbed every detail. The evidence was undeniable. When the video ended, the judge didn't waste a moment. Sergeant Briggs, he said, his voice steady but firm, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement. He turned to the prosecutor, nodding for him to continue. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Foster are hereby dismissed, the judge declared, his gavel coming down with a finality that echoed through the room. And I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs' conduct. Clayton's face was a mask of disbelief, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Maya stood, gathering her things with calm precision. She glanced at him one last time. Their eyes met, but no words passed between them. She didn't need to say anything. This time it wasn't her reputation on the line. It was his, and he knew it. Clayton stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished hallways. His face was flushed, his jaw tight, and he could feel the eyes on him. His colleagues, reporters who had shown up after word of the case spread. Everyone was watching. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being the one under scrutiny. He was used to controlling the narrative, walking into rooms and demanding respect or fear. But now that power was slipping from his grasp, and he didn't know how to stop it. A sharp voice broke through the noise, and Clayton turned to see Chief Eldon Baker standing in front of him. Baker's arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. The older man had been with the department for over 30 years, a respected figure who commanded authority. Clayton straightened, trying to hold onto whatever dignity he had left. "Sergeant," Baker said, his voice calm but dangerous. "What the hell were you thinking?" Clayton exhaled sharply, but Baker wasn't interested in hearing excuses. "I was doing my job," Clayton muttered, his voice defensive. Baker scoffed, throwing a file onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. "That's not what it looks like from here," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The body cam footage, the arrest history, the fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting. This isn't a mistake, Clayton. This is misconduct." Clayton's nostrils flared as he tried to defend himself. "What does that have to do with anything?" he snapped. Baker leaned forward, his voice quiet but sharp. "Everything," he said. "This wasn't some random woman you pulled over. This was a high-ranking Navy officer. And now you've put this department at risk." Clayton's face went pale as the reality of the situation sank in. "You think this is just going to disappear?" Baker continued. "The DA is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling. If they find what I think they're going to find, your career is over." Clayton's stomach dropped, and for the first time, he realized just how much trouble he was in. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice shaky. Baker didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave a small, humorless laugh. "It means you're on immediate suspension. Internal Affairs is investigating. And if they find what they're looking for, you're done." Clayton's heart sank. He had always believed that his badge protected him, that his power was untouchable. But now, everything was unraveling in front of him. Maya, meanwhile, was sitting in a quiet cafe across town, scrolling through her phone. The case had already made headlines. The video had gone viral. The story of the wrongful arrest was everywhere, and Clayton's name was being dragged through the mud. Maya wasn't surprised. She had known from the beginning that this would happen. The system had a way of protecting those in power, but it also had a way of exposing the truth when people refused to back down. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her attorney. Briggs has been suspended. Might face charges. Maya took a slow sip of her coffee, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. Good, she muttered, glancing out the window at the city moving on around her. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today was a win. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a number she recognized. She sighed, then answered. Captain, the familiar voice greeted her. I assume you've seen the news. I have, Maya replied, her voice steady. A brief silence passed before the captain spoke again. And how are you feeling? Maya glanced at her reflection in the storefront window. She didn't look defeated. There were no cracks in her composure. I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do, she said. Her voice calm. The captain's voice softened. That's what I thought you'd say. The Department of Defense is taking interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it. Maya exhaled through her nose. Not sure I'm interested in being a headline. The captain chuckled. You already are. Maya closed her eyes for a second, letting the weight of the situation settle over her. She wasn't interested in fame, but she understood now that her fight wasn't just about her. It was about the people who couldn't fight, the ones who didn't have the power to stand up against people like Clayton. This wasn't just a battle for her own dignity. It was for everyone who had ever been wronged. She glanced back at the phone. I'll think about it, she said, ending the call. Across the street, a mother walked with her young son, his small hand tightly gripping hers. The boy was laughing, carefree, full of life. Maya watched them for a moment, understanding that her fight wasn't just for herself, but for the next generation. She had fought to ensure that they wouldn't have to face the same injustices she had. She took a deep breath and walked away, her steps steady, her purpose clear, because the fight wasn't just hers. It had never been. Power unchecked is power abused. And the only way to change the system was to hold it accountable. What happened to Maya wasn't an isolated incident. It was something that happened every day, to people who didn't have the privilege to fight back. That's why it was so important to speak up, to demand change, and to refuse to stay silent. Real change started with real conversations.